All right, I think we could get started. Um, so welcome everybody to another Open Game Data Open Office Hours. So the Open Game Data community is a research community bringing together a collective of researchers interested in understanding human thinking, learning, and decision making using data generated in and around games. We have two primary goals here. One is to compile a collection of best practices and resources on how people approach these questions, and then the other is to build some concrete research infrastructure. And so some of that we'll be talking about today. We've got a bunch of resources available, all of which are mostly housed at opengamedata.io. That's kind of a central place to look for all of our stuff. We also have these open office hour sessions, which are getting migrated over to that website, but are not quite there yet. How these sessions typically work is they're inspired by a series of sessions we used to do here at Carnegie Mellon. It's actually possible we've now been doing this longer than those sessions at Carnegie Mellon took place, so maybe I don't need to include this anymore. But the idea is that someone who's working on a problem would talk to a member of the faculty as if they were going to office hours, but they would do it publicly. And so you could sit in that room and you can kind of see how experts broke down problems, thought about their things, and move things forward. And so typically we'll have somebody present a bit on context, and then we'll kind of open up the floor for people to talk. And we record these things to turn them into resources for the community. Some things to keep in mind is that presenters are showing work that is in progress most of the time. And so it takes keep in mind that that can take some courage and some consideration. And also expect ideas to be rough, analyses to be not complete, things to be kind of working and not necessarily worked out. And our goal is to help the presenters kind of make progress on their own work, but these sessions are also designed to be learning for everybody involved. So if you got a question, somebody brings something up you've never heard of, feel free to raise a hand, and we'll talk about it. And with that, I will hand off to Luke and somewhat technically myself. But today we're talking about progress or sort of the current status of um, the standard open game data schema that we've been working on.
I just put it in a data management plan as the Open Game Data 1.0 standard. So, um, yeah, it has to exist soon.
Can we go
Yeah.
0.1? Can we be an alpha?
No, I said it was 1.0 and shipped it. So I don't know how long we have until the reviewers read that, but I want it to be true.
Yeah. Um, I think we are kind of somewhere between an alpha and something we've been refining, but we could probably take what we currently have and ship it as a 1.0 if we really needed to.
Uh-huh.
But we'll get into it.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for showing up today. So basically how this is going to work is I'm going to give like a brief presentation, just kind of catching people up on what we've been working on. This has been a project that Erik and I and Jesse Younger have been working on for a good number of months now. We've already had one office hour on the topic, and we're back with an update on some more work that we've been doing, some progress that we've made. And then most of this hour, I think we're going to try to devote to discussion, whereas the last time around, we kind of just talked about a bunch of stuff and ran out of time to discuss them. Um, but just as sort of a little bit of a starting point here, I think it's helpful with all of the different office hours that we have over time. There's so many different kinds of data that get talked about. A lot of it is, about games, or it's about opinions on games and feelings about games or surveys about games. Um, and so it's helpful, I think, just to talk a little bit about the what events and event data mean here. Um, and so really what this concerns is a specific kind of game data that is gameplay data. If you go on the Open Game Data website and follow whichever links you need to get to the data sets, what you'll find for most of those, for every game at minimum, is a bunch of event data sets. And the idea is that within a game, um, players start playing, a whole bunch of things happen in some sequence of events. So the player clicks a button, the player moves their chess piece, an enemy takes damage, a bunch of different individual occurrences within a game that happen at some particular moment and change the state of the game in some way. Um, and so historically, a lot of the earlier work that we did within open game data towards collecting event data from games was based on uh, a conceptual framework from Liz Owen and Ryan Baker that sort of talked about event data as being a series of player actions, system feedback on those actions, and game progression. One of the observations in the work that we've been doing is that that's maybe it's very heavily rooted in sort of the tradition of intelligent tutoring systems and may not quite cover all the different things that can happen in games, but it is a very useful starting point just to sort of conceptualize what events look like in a game. Player takes some action, the game does something in response, the player progresses through the game, level by level, uh, or in some other way gets closer and closer to completing the game. And all of that we collect from the game as telemetry, and that forms the basis of an analytics pipeline. And that analytics pipeline helps us to get higher level insights about player performance or attributes of the game. And those analytics typically form the basis for scientific analysis and the questions that we ask about a game. So taking all that in mind, the really important piece here is that the events that you collect from a game ultimately determine the questions that you can answer about gameplay with your data, which isn't necessarily a particularly deep observation. In most cases, the data you collect determines what questions you can answer. But there is sort of that level of abstraction that it can be really easy to think about the analytics as your data and to lose sight of the fact that the events that are being collected that form the basis of that are really the most fundamental thing that determines what analyses you can conduct, what questions you can answer about your game. And so the goal of this project ultimately is to create some kind of a foundational standard for the collection of event data across digital games so that everyone has a shared point of reference, a shared vocabulary to talk about events that occur within games. And that improves, everything about doing open science and open game data is shared ideas, shared infrastructure, shared analyses. So the last time that we talked about this was back in November. And we spent most of our time talking about the Open Game Data Event Schema, which specifically determines essentially what should come with every event that comes out of a game. And just at a really high level, what we talked about was some of the conclusions that we came to that every event should include some identifying information that answers the question of who played and what game did they play, versioning and configuration data, which answers the question of how could this data be reproduced, provenance, which answers where did this data come from, sequencing, when did things happen in relation to each other, segmenting, which part of the game did this event happen in, and context. So what was the state of the game when this event occurred? And those are the things that kind of should go with every event, no matter what, so that you can say, you can look at one individual event and kind of understand it. And then, of course, there's some event-specific data that makes this specific event this specific event. And so typically that would include something like an event name that sort of describes in human language what happened. So player moved their chess piece, enemy took damage, something that's humanly readable. An event ID that the way we've thought about this is sort of like a little bit of a Dewey Decimal System for event data. So some sort of a numeric code that helps us categorize an event even across games. And then an event payload, and that's just the really specific details. What about the game changed as a result of this event? And the thing that's been the focus since then has primarily been those event IDs. And those feed into what I'm referring to as the event standard. So where the schema talked about the shape of the data, standard says here's a standardized way to talk about the different kinds of events that occur. Um, and sort of the observation here is if we look at a bunch of different games and we look at all the events that happen in those games and everything that you could log from them, we can start defining some typologies of different kinds of events that we see occurring across different games. And then the question becomes, could we define enough of those typologies to do, say, 90% of the work of getting a new game um, equipped with the logic to log out a bunch of telemetry data as a series of events? And so the idea with these event codes is that we would have a 4-digit code that defines an event type ID, where our first digit defines a broad category of event. Our second digit we've been calling the family. So within a category, which usually tells you something about um, where the event came from, whether it was a player or the system, um, or a hardware event. The family just further breaks that down into subcategories. Our third digit doesn't really have a name yet because not every family so far has needed to use the third digit meaningfully. But as this work continues, we're expecting to make good use of that third digit. Better to have one more digit than you need than one less than you need. And lastly, that fourth digit defines the verb. So just to take like a really concrete example here, within our proposed event standard, the 4506 code refers to discarding a resource. So our category is player action. The player did something. The family within player actions is resource management. Our third digit in this case wasn't really needed for this family, so it's just 0. And our verb is discard. So discard resource. Collect a resource, I think, was 4502. Right? So you get these nice sort of, like I said, sort of like a miniaturized version of a Dewey Decimal System for event data. And so Eric and Jesse and I spent a lot of time just sort of sorting out what our categories could be, what the families within those categories could be. Just as a point of reference, here's all the different top level categories that we've defined. Don't want to go through them in too much detail, but a couple things to call out here. The 2, 3, and 4,000 blocks here that cover dialogue, which includes explicit feedback from the game, segmentation, which includes progression events, and player actions, broadly cover the kinds of events that you would get applying the Baker and Owen framework. And there's a couple places here we've gone a little bit above and beyond that. So the 5000s block captures some non-textual feedback, but it also captures system actions that aren't necessarily feedback, that are really useful in games that don't necessarily privilege the player in the same way that something from more of a intelligent tutor background might. So a lot of strategy games, for example, will treat the player as no different than any of the computer controlled players. And so it's helpful to go a little bit beyond what we had done before in order to capture a wider variety of events. Yeah, and then there's this general pattern where the 9000 block is open for any custom events that don't fit into our standard because our standard will never fit anything. And within each category, the 900 block is reserved as open because we'll never be able to capture everything, even within a category. So where we sit right now is we did all of that work to propose an initial version of that standard. And then the immediate question becomes, well, is this standard actually useful? How can we validate this and make sure that someone, a real world game developer could sit down and apply this standard and actually save themselves effort by using our standard instead of just making up their own set of events? And so we've got an ongoing small scale study. in which we have a pair of game development interns from Field Day Lab that we're working with. And the idea here is if a student intern is able to use our standard, if our standard is so clear and easy to understand, um, that someone can come in to their first internship in game development and immediately understand how to use that standard, then certainly anyone at a greater level of experience and seniority should be able to use it as well. So this felt like a really good starting point for validating that standard. And we essentially have been having them record short clips of gameplay from a variety of games, um, and to then apply essentially qualitative coding process in 5-second intervals of those gameplay clips to say, here are the events that occurred within each 5-second segment. And then we get the group together to discuss what those interns, any questions that they had, any issues that they ran into, any shortcomings in the standard as they were working on coding a new set of games. And we refine either our instructions on how to apply the standard or the standard itself to resolve the issues that arise. And ultimately, our goal here is to reach a point where we get a reasonable inter-rater reliability between our pair of interns. And if we reach that point, then we have some amount of confidence that this is both a usable standard and a consistently usable standard where two people looking at the same game will ultimately agree on what each event is and what each event means. And from there, some of the future work that we're hoping to do is to create a reference implementation of this initial schema and standard within the existing open game data telemetry libraries. And what that should do is unlock additional game developers out there in the world to be able to play around with this and test it out and give feedback and unlock the next round of validation of our work. For the very immediate future, as in the next 40 minutes, with all of you in the room, what felt like a good way to center today's discussion is to sort of go back to way back on the first slide. Um, I mentioned that the event data that you collect determines the questions that you can answer, right? And the work that we've done so far has been very bottom up, where we try to figure out what all the events might be so we can capture them in this categorization scheme. And it would be helpful to attack that from the other end and to say, well, what questions do people actually want to answer through gameplay data? And what events would need to be captured in order to satisfactorily, is that the right? I can't. To answer those questions in a satisfactory way. I don't know if satisfactorily is a word or not,
I don't
but it
think so.
sounds like it should be.
I
Um,
think so.
yeah. And I think Eric and Jesse and Max, who's also been involved primarily in the iterator reliability portion of that study. If any of you have comments you'd like to add right now, that'd be great. Otherwise, I'd like to open up the discussion and to start talking about the questions, research questions that people have from their own games.
Do you have the a link to the current schema doc that might be useful for?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me pop out of sharing here, and I can go find that link.
Did, can I flip it on you a little bit and say, are there any challenges or problem areas or insecurities that you're thinking about right now that you are trying to see addressed? Or is this truly at the phase of open comment?
I
Yeah.
think uh, oh, I mean, if you want to answer first, you can.
Go ahead, Eric.
I think a challenge that I've been thinking about is, are we too granular? Like, is this thing like really hard to use and apply? Because there's just too many damn codes. Uh, and um, and so that's partly why I was interested in doing this sort of integrated reliability experiment of
Yeah.
essentially like if you were to hand this thing to two different people, would they apply the same codes? If they don't, then maybe it's too ambiguous. So there's lots of different possible ways you could interpret things, and if that's going to be the case, that's just going to muddy all downstream analysis. Um, and and so I think there are places uh, where we're looking at sort of a breadth of different kinds of game, where certain games, some of these things make a lot more sense than others, and in trying to come up with a schema that can cover all kinds of games, um, it becomes a challenge. Like I think the next sort of empirical version of this that I would do, which is probably more like actual study than any of this engineering stuff ever normally gets, is like you find a game and you hand it to two engineers and be like, implement this schema for this game. And like two, they do the same thing. Because that's kind of important that they do that. And I'm not sure where we are right now in terms of specificity. I think actually where we hit the very first pass at um player actions is actually pretty broad. And so that actually might be reasonably scoped. Because we didn't actually specify that many player actions in the first draft. Um, but yeah, I don't know. That's kind of the thing that I worry the most about is like you hand this to somebody and is it just too much decision making?
Yeah, I'll say that the initial IRR calculation showed that the reliability between the two coders is fairly low. It's like less than like zero point 0.5 on like all of the different metrics. Um, but the more details about like potentially other types of games. So far, I think like only like three different games have been coded. Um, and then some other ways to look at comparing what the coders did other than just IRR.
Yeah, and I think um, to add to some of that, um, when it comes to those player actions that Eric mentioned, that like the player actions and the system actions have been kind of the focus of that project that we've had with the interns, uh, mostly because there's like the question of are there certain things that we've completely missed there in that breadth? Um, Part of how we attacked that was to think about different sort of different genres of game mechanic as a reasonable way to help identify the different kinds of actions that players could take across games. But of course, there's any number of different kinds of game mechanic out there. Um, and so there's sort of a question of, are there styles of game that we just haven't even thought about yet that ought to have a place to live within that standard of here's the events that happen in this kind of a game.
Two thoughts. One of them is the inter-rater reliability concerns me because that's the whole point of it, is to be concerning as a sanity check. And I know from other projects that getting codes to have high reliability is hard, and it's easier when you have less of them. So, as a rule. So that makes me ask the question, is there a data-driven way for us to determine how explicit and how small-grained the not taxonomy, the lexicon should be? Like, is there a sweet spot where you say, once we get to the level of 20 words that we always use, 20 codes, numerical codes, that the reliability is high enough that when we go to 21, it falls beneath the threshold given normal people, and reasonable amounts of minimal training.
I
And you
think
can do that mathematically if you get enough students. You can literally pick the number. It'll tell you.
yeah. Some of the challenge, I think, is partly from how we've been doing the iterated reliability, where we've got a video clip and then we're having them assign codes on 5-second intervals, which is pretty wide.
Because a lot happens in 5 seconds.
Yeah,
I see.
yeah. And it's 5 seconds, right? It's yeah. And so I think one analysis we do want to look at, which might help inform some of that, is you could do a first pass of code or not. Like, did you assign anything in a window of time? And then you can kind of work it down the hierarchy. So it's like, did you assign any code? Did you assign a 4,000 code? Did you assign a 4,600 code?
Yeah, there you go.
Like, and then eventually hit the point where like, okay, yeah, now below here it doesn't really matter.
That's right.
And and ideally you do that at a smaller time interval than 5 seconds, but it was sort of like we're sort of juggling because these interns, like, this isn't their main job. It's some side thing they're doing. And so there's like juggling the amount of time it takes to make the videos and code the videos and do all the stuff. So there's sort of like a trying to save labor / validate a method. Because also coding 5 minutes at the second level takes a really long time. So
Yep. 300 of them. Yep.
Yeah. And so I wonder then if it might just be, I wonder if trying to do the other way around of like, here's a game and implement a schema. And then like we have some standard way of playing it. And we look at how well do the traces line up with each other? Like kind of doing it the other way around. Might be an interesting way to try to do it. That's maybe even closer to the actual use case where it's like, here's the schema, here's a game, build it, go. But then you got to make sure you cover sort of a swath of games. And ideally, they'd be a game that they built, not a game that you're pre-giving them. But
the other thing that makes me think of as I'm hearing you talk about like the process of like going through these 5-second clips is just how often events overlay each other. And like the room for error just in, okay, I'm going to tag 8 things in this segment. Well, like what the priority is might just be where you're getting some misalignment there too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Coding of clips seems problematic, to be honest. In that regard, best idea I've heard, but seems problematic.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. The core here, the core function for this thing as a standard is like, would you describe this segment of gameplay in the same way as somebody else? And yeah, the best way I could think of to do that was doing this video coding thing. But
no, it's a great idea. I just, now that you've done it, I could see where it'd be really hard.
But there's still going to be limits to that.
I'm thinking about how like I had to be trained on this for PBS, right? Like this was my job. But you do have to be trained on it. Right? And I think that's the downfall. And there's this like this full lexicon, shall we call it, is meant to represent like every game. And so most games are not going to use most of the codes that are
Yep.
in there. And
Sparse.
so how do we teach these things? Or like how do we get people to the relevant information faster? And oh man, now I'm building a web app for a thing. Can we just make this an interactive dictionary so then that like you pick what kind of mechanism you have and it shows you suggested codes? Um,
I mean, there's also a degree to which I wonder you could just hand the entire lexicon to Claude and have it put it into a game, and
Me
how close
too.
is it going to get? Uh,
Right.
That's a natural experiment we should try at some point once we've
yeah.
got something that works.
Um, there's also, I've seen people experimenting with like, why even bother with telemetry? Just generate event codes looking at a video. Why instrument anything other than the fact that video is so much
Those,
heavier than telemetry logs?
yeah, those people are dumb, and I'm not even going to talk about that anymore.
Well,
That's
but
Well,
all
or
that
I
you could
got.
just
also
run
like,
it as a browser extension. So what if the vault was just instrumented to be
People,
reading your
oh my
screen and
gosh.
generating telemetry straight to open game data without ever having to touch somebody else's game? Like, you can do stuff like
Terrifying.
that, but that's all kind of more
yeah,
esoteric. Um,
But
um,
like that also goes back to the difference between telemetry and video. And
mhm.
like maybe trying to code video with something that's meant to be used on telemetry is just
Not the right way to do
hard
it. Yeah.
because
So,
like, or go ahead.
sorry. Did I maybe miss that we said that they were only meant to be coding like the player action blocks, so not like all the
Yeah.
like dialogue happened because you know what? Not really concerned that people are going to code dialogue things differently. Or anyways, it's like way
Yeah,
I,
for this initial work, we've had them focus on the player actions, the system actions, um, since that was sort of our biggest blind spot, and just for scope control, like given that it already took, I think the first, clip or two, it got faster as they went, but the first clip or two, I think the interns talked about it taking like 2 hours to code a 5-minute clip.
Oh my gosh.
Um, and so
it's
if we had
that
them, also trying to
I don't
navigate
know.
some of the other categories, of course, that would just build.
that's not an uncommon pattern for qualitative coding in general. That the
Yep.
first couple times you do it takes a lot longer.
Yep.
Um, but I think we would need more of their time to really make meaningful progress.
Mhm.
Um,
did you at PBS ever um do inter-rater reliability like activities where you had two different people code it and then argue and or discuss?
Well, yes, as part of the process, sort of te hmm. Um, so yes and no. So we had a research partner that would actually develop the schema for us. Um, and we didn't actually have um, as defined of a lexicon I like calling it a lexicon. We didn't have as defined as what this open game code is. Um, so like sometimes things weren't consistent across games and it didn't matter for us. We
Yeah,
didn't
you just
have
thought about
fully
one game at a time.
standardized
Hmm.
processing pipelines. Yeah. But we were working on it and I did do so typically what would happen is that like they would do their pass, I would do it and look at it and say like, oh, I think actually this is something else and shouldn't this event be that thing? And so like there was it was still sort of an iterative process. Um, because there are some hard calls in there.
Reliably, there will be hard calls, right?
mhm.
Yeah. And though I did one time, I was curious to see if I started from scratch and the other person started from scratch, how close were ours? And they're pretty close.
Yeah.
And there's way few, like the games at PBS are way
Simpler.
um, simpler.
Yeah.
Mhm.
way, way simpler.
Yeah.
Like the simplest possible use case, right? By design, like by philosophy, the simplest, most repetitive, most predictable. Yeah, by philosophy.
That compliment just gets more and more backhanded the more adjectives you attach to it.
It's for preschoolers.
Yeah, no, it's not backhanded. But it is something to call out that
Yeah.
while, making things uniform, for an audience is one side, the thing that we're trying to prepare for is the opposite of that, which is novelty in every possible mechanical innovation that a new designer can come up with, which means that this will never be perfect.
Yeah.
Ever. It'll always just be lagging behind, describing the kinds of mechanics that we already have kind of labeled. And so I think that's helpful to know, though, right? It's like it'll never be perfect. Don't even try, because it by design will always lag behind design.
Yeah. But that's also partly why we came in with the prompt we came in with, which you flipped back on us. So I'm going to flip it back on you again. Is if you take it from an analysis, like essentially backwards from analysis, particular kinds of standardized analyses are going to have demands of their input. And those are the things we can build a standard around.
Yep.
So I think for me, the most consistent thing that I'm 100% confident in is the 3000s block, which is about segmentation. So like the start, stop, piece of game, like level, world, whatever. And then there's one for that, which allows you to go down 10 levels of nesting, which I don't think any game I've ever seen is that complicated. But and then there's segmentation within like space. So there's different parts of a space of a world that you might care about. And then there can be I think there's 2 or 3 others, but those 100% having sentinels of start and end for various kinds of segmentation will be usable in almost any game that I ever thought about, and will inform analysis pipelines down the line. They're essentially the pieces of content that you select events between and then do something with. And like that's going to work 100% every game. Total sense. And so then it's kind of like, what other kinds of things like that do we care about that we might want events for? I think, for example, like if I was to do like a learning curve analysis, I need a correctness signal. I need a feedback signal to learners. And so there's actually a whole segment of dialogue or whatever that's called feedback. I just need to know if it's positive or negative. I don't really care if there was a message or whatever, we can deal with that. But like the ability to say something was right or not, and knowing when that happened, and then knowing what action it was associated with. And then
That's
you can do
dangerous.
analysis.
I'll just call it out. To build that into the game is just really dangerous because it's like the point of this schema has to be, what is the, I can't even think of a better word, but ontological reality that is baked into the actual existence of a given interaction that is separate from any interpretation that could be done down the road. That's what we're trying to get at with this. And by definition, new games are going to come up with new verbs because they're going to come up with new objects that you interact with in new ways, because that's just what game designers do all day long. But a lot of them are common. So I really think that we should always make sure to never take 2 moves in one logging step, because rightness, correctness, anything where you've got a fidelity of implementation that is subjective. And so when I say that, it's like you can think you're doing something, but you're actually doing something else in design because it's interpreted some other way. And so that's super dangerous. Like if we try to put those together, instead we want to do that as a second order analysis. So to find out how well something was implemented, or for example, like humor, if I code something is funny, you're like, but was it? And the only way you can really know is you've come up with some other analysis to say, this piece of script happened. Do people find it funny is the question you have to ask.
So
But
just to like clarify a little bit, within that like feedback portion of that standard, positive, negative feedback, correctness or not, isn't about that sort of second order correctness. It's like if you've got a puzzle game and there's a correct solution or not, at some point the game tells you you got the correct solution, right? And that's the thing that the standard is addressing. And then that's the thing that down the line you would use to do, your learning curve analysis or your other types of analysis. But yeah, the suggestion here is not that we embed qualitative notions of correctness into the logging, but that within the semantics of the game itself, when you're told this was correct, that's a signal that you want to capture.
That makes sense. You can know you told someone that was correct.
yeah,
That
the
happened.
game
Objectively
system,
happened. Yeah.
the game system has an opinion about its ontology,
Yeah.
right?
That makes sense.
And that's the thing you're recording.
That makes
Whether or
sense.
not it could be interpreted differently by a player is something you could do down the line, but you're muted, Jen.
Especially thinking about like open game data, I like using Wake as an example. I have the affordance that like I designed the jobs in Wake. It makes that easy for me to know, did they pick the right thing to go do an experiment with? And we have the like jobs JSON file that's separate that we can use to like pull all of that data in to see if it's relevant. Even with all of that, I still had to go and like create my own map of what species exist in what ecosystem. Because that's not captured anywhere in the data or in that loc file. Like, and that is particularly tricky for people who are coming to analyze a game that they don't inherently know or didn't take part in designing. And I'm even thinking about ShadowSpect, like one of the things that I had implemented in our analysis pipeline for that is like, was something a good move? There were like shapes that were either should be added to the puzzle or should not be, and that's a system decision. But for me to like climb through the game code to figure out which things were viable solutions is kind of terrible. Especially if it's like not a game that I was part of making, or there are varying development pathways that I am able to decipher. Some code is easier to read than others. And so like even being able to figure out where do I go look for that information as somebody who wants to do analysis along those lines, having that embedded in some way, I thought it was interesting. Like when I first opened this document, that it said that the event records can't encode judgment or analytic interpretation. But where or how do you get the information about like designer intention or that underlying system logic that is creating a judgment about whether the player is approaching success or failure into the log at some level?
So we do have some of that information. So it's that the event like name and code itself cannot be like, oh, they got a correct answer. It's that they answered the question. And then part of the payload, which this guide doesn't go into actually, is this very gigantic payload that we're imagining goes along with all the events. The payload move if it's like a move. Am I cutting out?
A little bit. A little.
Sorry.
I thought it was my
Good now.
computer. I couldn't tell. Yeah.
So on the payload, we're capturing the information that would be necessary to make that sort of evaluation. So like if it's a puzzle, like before you had this and after this you had that. So it's like, and sometimes with like the PBS stuff, you would have like, is the answer correct after this placement? And oftentimes that's not when the kids are actually submitting it, then they keep doing things, right? And so you're saying like, well, what's the state of this thing once they did this action? So you can record there, like whether the system thinks that it's correct or not. It's that we don't want the event to be like a correct placement or an incorrect placement. We don't want the events themselves to be inferring um, intent or correctness or whatever, because we don't know if, like, just because they put it in the right spot doesn't mean that they did that on purpose or that they knew why they did that, or like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's that statistical interpretation layer that needs to be there that learning curves help with. And
Yeah, and I think to get also a little bit at what Jen was talking about, like there's the stuff that like there's something about the event oriented perspective that's all based on what happened in the game. And I think what Jen was alluding to is a little bit more to do with like um what is the design of the game within which this thing happened. So like in Wake, you can conduct an experiment and collect a fact. If you happen to have the right combination of things, you might find a new fact. And usually, informally, the correct bunch of things in your experiment usually means you've got a fish in its natural habitat, and then you find some new information about the fish. Um, and so by collecting event data alone, you're able to answer the question of like, okay, did they get the fact or not? Did they put the right fish in to get a particular fact? But that doesn't necessarily capture like what actually is the right environment for this kind of fish or that kind of fish. The kinds of things that you would need at the like analytics pipeline level to actually know um, what gets you closer to a correct answer or not, or what gets you closer to your objective or not, that is based in the game design, and that maybe one of the limiting factors once you hit that analysis level is not do I have the right events or not, but it's do I have the right background information on the game's design to even interpret these events?
yeah, which is a whole different problem of how to document the internal logic of a game that we should work on at some point, but we get to carve off that as another day.
Well,
But I think we settled it. In my mind, I feel really resolved that if you're logging that you told the player they did something correct, that totally makes sense. If you log progression happened, that that objectively happened. And I think I didn't read the part that everybody put in about how subjective analysis is out of scope for this. And I think that philosophy is there, and it's always going to be hard to wrestle through that. Can I ask first? I realize I missed like a moment of praise in here. This is looking so great. I'm like so excited. Like we're right there. It's like it's there. It's really there. And I don't want to confuse a thing being useful with graduate students on some IEEE conference board that like it. So let's not confuse that. Who cares what the graduate students viewing a paper about how we wrote this think about it? That's a different problem, how to impress them. And it's irrelevant to generally speaking, but I do love the idea that we could like have some way that we could say, we know it's ready when, and there was some metric or some threshold we know that we could identify and then cross. So I really like this validity approach, but I'm just really thrilled with where it's at right now because it looks so useful right now. Like right now, it looks useful. So I guess my comment is let's make sure to separate how to impress reviewers on a paper about our process from how do we do something useful with this process.
Well, so I haven't really been thinking about this is like how do we impress reviewers? It's like the thing that I'm most interested in with this, which is why the iterator reliability framing is actually really useful because it's literally what iterator reliability is for.
Yeah.
Is do two random people off the street do these things the same? It's essentially what IRR measures. And so like all this idea of like, oh, you have to be trained in it, and then you have this back and forth discussions like, no, never again. Solve it once, have it written well enough that when you grab a random person off the street, they apply it the same.
Let's just say that training is part of the code book
as the people that built it. And that's going to take some iterations and some work, but that to me is the goal. It's like if I were to grab a random undergraduate student who's going to be an intern at field day, and implementing this in a new game,
It'd be great if you could get there,
they'll
right? If they
generate
could
the
read a
codes
document.
correctly without a
Yep.
lot of hand-holding and discussion and back and forth and negotiation.
Yep.
And that's the goal. And iterator reliability is literally the statistical measure of that. It's not there yet, and it'll take some time and iteration and whatever. We'll rewrite the document, and who knows what AI can just do it eventually. But that to me is why I kind of took that IRR framing. Is like it's like literally the point.
So, is it reasonable that an undergraduate can do this?
I want it to
Yes.
be.
We
I don't
want
think
it
it is
there.
yet.
Yep.
But that is the people that build education. That is the lowest level of people that build educational games.
And Jesse, we respect your brilliance and your uniqueness in the world. I just totally deeply respect it. But
No.
optimally, we would make it easier than having to always have you so that we could crank this crap out.
Oh, yeah. But yes, no, it can't be that you have to be me to do it. No, an undergraduate with what kinds of experience? Like these
I love Eric's
make-
school that they
Huh?
come into a room and they read something and you pay a minimum wage and then bada boom, bada bing, 100% reliability. That's the goal.
Now, I think there's a couple of additional things here, which maybe, I don't know, maybe this goes in the PISOS grant or some other grant or something. But I think there's a couple of things we need to do here. One is a better guide. Two is better software. So the logging library that implements this thing, you should never have to touch the 3,000 codes ever. That can get built into the game engine. You don't even have to think about it. And then some of these other ones of like everything involving a UI element, that can just happen. Like you never have to think about it. It will log the correct event. So like there's a bunch of these pieces in here where you can get a lot of these things automatically from just the way game agents are built.
Yeah, that would be really cool.
And I don't know, maybe that's me coming from the land that CTAT built, but that's how CTAT works. And you never need to think about how any of our tutors log. They always log the same because they're always built with the same tool chain. And you could just do that with Unity, Unreal, Godot pretty straightforward. And there's kind of the question of like, where are the places you do need to think? And when you do need to think, how do you implement those? Because the way you do build most games is you are like my hypothesis, which has always kind of been untested, but my hypothesis from my own research in my thesis was that like a random game developer, if you're asking them to implement telemetry into their game, they probably know where in the code the events happen because they had to make them happen.
That's who I think this could be designed for.
Yeah, and so, but I think starting at an undergraduate level, that's where a lot of educational games get built. Is part-time students working at universities. There's not necessarily the best educational games, but that's where a lot of educational games get built.
So just to make sure that I'm like catching this correctly, though, Jesse, it sounds like your suggestion is that maybe the place to target is not random undergraduate with random game, but random undergraduate with the game that undergraduate built.
Yeah,
Is that the angle that you're taking?
actually, right. Like they have to know something about games.
Yeah. They need to have something about games. That you're like in a game dev program, like they're an intern on a game dev project. Like they're not a random undergraduate off the street. They probably have a CS background. Like,
yeah, I think the distinction here is
random
it
undergraduate off the street.
I think the
random
distinction,
undergraduate off the street that you would hire to work on a game dev project as an intern at a university.
Okay. That makes me feel better. That's what I'm saying. It can't be a random person. Like, no, I'm not having an English lit major that doesn't play games understand this.
But the kind of students that field day would hire to work on their project, which is literally the people doing the reliability right now.
Right. But to Luke's point, I think it's way easier to code your own game or a game that you're super familiar with than like the way that we did it of here's this like 5 games you've never seen, or I don't know which ones they've seen, but
and that's always the ideal with projects like this. It's just really hard to find developers that are at like the perfect stage of a project to do that. That's either done and they never want to touch it again, or they're too busy building all the rest of the stuff to think about it. Like, yeah, so it's like you need to find like a golden moment in production to get that perfect audience to actually do it in any kind of validation way. I think that's still where people are going to be doing it.
I wonder if there's like an intermediate type of participant who might not necessarily have the complete technical skills or like a full coded game, but that are like at least like interested in game development, and have like the interest to uh look into like the details of a game and code it. That's kind of the type of person that I'm looking for currently for my other project. Um,
Yeah, and I wonder if there's space to be thinking about like what would a game designer who is not necessarily doing the implementation but is designing the mechanics within a game potentially in as good or even better of a place to identify and name the events than someone whose primary job is to take a design and implement it.
That so like I'm wondering for your coding task if there would actually be value in just coding schemas. In seeing like given the events, like does it actually make sense to match them with these categories? And can people reliably even do that? uh
Yeah.
where I really see utility, and maybe it's just because I've had to get kind of creative recently with some analyses, is like I think that this provides a lot of food for thought of every start event here also has an end. And I can't tell you how many events I run into that don't have ends. Where I'm like, oh, that no wonder my like distribution looks bizarre because there are some that are literally 15 hours long. And that's not real. They probably like clicked off a tab and left the game running or something happened, whatever that case may be. But like as a reminder to the people instrumenting the games of like you should have these as paired events. Um, I could see being really interesting. And also, I wonder, like, given this framework from a utility standpoint, if you had somebody who is an undergrad building their own educational game and they go to instrument it and then you gave them this as a like scaffold, how does their instrumentation change? I think that could be really interesting to see like what didn't they think of, what didn't they like capture initially that then they're like, oh no, I actually should put that in. Um, when they see like the full array of options.
Hmm.
I so I do think the ultimate goal with this thing is it's not just a guide, it's also software. And so you're essentially handing them not just this, you're handing them the API docs to use the software library. And um so like I think you could give them this guide when they've already kind of built something like now, which is sort of like a intermediate step in the development of the thing overall. And that might be interesting to see if they forgot something.
Even
It
as a piece
starts
of software, I think about like
right,
Copilot and its ability to be like, did you actually mean to also run this other
right,
thing, or did you mean to like pair these two functions together? Uh, being able to have it suggest or whatever in like a perfect world, where would you like to put this event that seems
yeah,
relevant to your game?
right, yeah. Um, it
You're
starts to
logging a
look
start, but the equivalent code for end just never appears. You probably need that somewhere, that kind of a thing.
yeah. There are ways to fix the start end problem with library engineering such that it's harder to make that mistake. Um, there are lots of signals you can actually detect to send to corrective end events, but the hard one being the leaving it open and idle. That's the one that's hard to actually do. But a lot of the others.
And another thing just to throw out there, just sort of an open question, is maybe a question of how much standardization is beneficial. Because I think we've sort of taken an assumption that the more comprehensively you can standardize, the better. And in a perfect idealized world where everyone's got infinite capacity to like digest a large standard and to understand it, or in a perfect world where software does it all for you, then yeah, more standardization is probably better. There's also, in the opposite direction though, the more pragmatic that you go, like how much of this do we actually need standardized in order to unlock the benefits of standardization, like um, shared analyses or shared analytics pipelines across games. Um, and is it possible that there are certain things that we've like been putting a lot of effort into standardizing that won't actually end up benefiting anyone? And I don't have any specific thoughts there. Um, but I think that's like the really interesting thing about trying to generate discussion around what people's questions are that they want to answer with their data. Because that maybe informs, well, those are clearly the things that we should be trying to standardize. And maybe some of the other, maybe there's some categories or families of codes here that just don't need a lot more work or development because no one's going to do a standardized analysis anyway.
I see where you're going, and maybe this analogy is the wrong one.
Hmm.
Uh, but I think about like libraries, and like there's a reason that there's a standardized way of organizing libraries, right?
Yep.
Because like one, you can find things easily. Like just the comprehensible structure of, oh, I go to this number and I know what I'm going to find there. It
Yep.
also allows you to realize that there are numbers assigned to things that you wouldn't have even imagined.
Yep.
And I think that that's one of the powerful things in having standardization is that it kind of helps to start mapping the space of things in a way that somebody who's asking their own questions might not have understood that that was even a possibility before.
Yep. Yeah. And like broadly, I agree with that. Mostly I'm playing devil's advocate here. The thing that I'll maybe throw out as devil's advocate on that libraries example is I I remember being like 10 and going to like a library event where they told us like the really basics of the Dewey Decimal System, and I understood none of it. And the only things that I know about the Dewey Decimal System to this day are the things that I like Googled while wondering whether it was a good analogy to our code system for this project. So like I think that's just the angle that I'm kind of working there is yeah, like the pragmatic versus the ideal. There's so many ideal versions of why being comprehensive is so great. Um, and those are the things that I broadly want to see in the world and that I broadly agree with. But there is sort of that pragmatism question of if nobody understands it, um, is there a smaller version of it that gets the most value, like the most value for the smallest effort, so that you get a wider variety of people who actually make use of it. Yeah, and none of that is like an opinionated statement here, just something that I think is helpful to be thinking about. What's the right balance between the extremes?
Cool. So we are a little over time. I think it was helpful discussion. I don't know if we necessarily resolved anything, but maybe brought up some interesting new questions. Actually, a new lens I like from Jen was I would slightly reframe the idea of like you took a lot of time to figure out what was going on inside WIG. Is to what extent can you use the data coming out of this kind of system to, as an analyst, understand the behavior of the game system itself? And towards the goal of, is it working the way you expect, which is what some of my earlier personal research worked on, of like, we built a whole physics system and it was giving feedback. It's like, oh, it's not doing what we wanted it to, which is a really important thing for you to realize when you're trying to be pedagogical. But that's also going to be super game specific. So how exactly we make sure that this does afford that kind of thing is an interesting question to have as a lens. Because I think I would at least maybe was getting a little too much like, oh yeah, did they get it right or wrong or whatever, and then that's it. And then like I think we need a couple more like sort of user stories almost behind the system. Uh but yeah, so we are next time we're going to hear from, I am blanking on their names, but Connectado, which is people who have used the existing open game data schema and connected it to XAPI. And so talking about schemas and APIs and structures and all that stuff, they've done some of that. And so we'll hear more from them in 2 weeks. I may or may not need a backup host for that. I will keep people posted. But yeah, thanks for joining everybody, and we'll be in touch.
Awesome. Thank you all. We'll talk to you later.